Welcome to the Modern CPA Success Show, where we're 100% focused on helping accounting firms achieve success. If you're an accounting firm owner who wants to learn how to provide virtual CFO services, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to today's podcast. Today, I'm joined once again by Adam Hale, and we're going to talk about first impressions and, more importantly, onboarding. So just to give you a little bit of background on the Summit onboarding process, this is something that we revisit about every 6 months. It's ever changing. We've talked about several times how Summit's a pretty dynamic firm, and we're always trying to change things. But onboarding is something that every time we get feedback from a client that the onboarding isn't going as well as they would like, we go in and we reevaluate the process, we dig into it, and we make changes. So this podcast will have a lot of lessons learned in it, a lot of stuff that we've done well, a lot of things that we still are working on improving. But I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this podcast. So Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I mean, getting off to the right start is essential. I mean, that's really everything. I think that if we look back over time, what we found is that every good relationship that we currently have it starts out right from the beginning, right? And so getting off to that right foot is going to be important to establishing the relationship and just getting the client the information. Because typically whenever clients come to us, they have a specific need and they want to get there as fast as possible. So I can tell you, like, before you were with us, Jamie, what we used to do was nothing super formal. Like, we didn't charge separately for onboarding. We didn't call it a separate thing. We didn't have a team designated for it. We just thought, hey, new client comes on, assign the team. The team will work through the issues. They're trying to work backward and forward kind of at the same time. And what we found is it just took forever. And the clients got super frustrated because you don't really have time to balance both going backwards and forwards at the same time. So that's whenever we decided, hey, we need to actually name it. There's a lot of power in just kind of naming things. So we're like, hey, onboarding. We decided we were going to double the fees for the first 8 weeks, tell clients it takes us about 2 months to fully get onboarded. That doesn't mean we want to really actually take 8 weeks for it to even be able to work with them. What it means is that give us a little bit of time to get our bearings straight and everything like that. And then we decided to bring on additional people into the onboarding process rather than just the core team in order to speed that process up.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that when I started, having the onboarding named was really important to me because it did identify it as, things are going to happen during these 8 weeks. They're going to happen outside and they're going to really set us up for the future. So I think having it named was super important. And I think the most recent lesson learned, and I think this is something where I'd like to start, is expectation. I think one of our keys in onboarding is setting the expectations from the client, setting the expectations for us, and really having connection between our sales process and our onboarding process is key. So Adam, will you go a little bit into the expectations we try to set during our onboarding?
Yeah, as you mentioned, though, it really should start with your sales process. So making sure everybody's in tune, the onboarding team and the sales team, just to make sure that we're getting the right fit. We want to talk about ideal client and communication. Of course, whenever you're in that dating process, you're focusing more on the services and the solutions. So it's natural just to kind of come in, with really positive, ready to move forward kind of expectations whenever you jump into onboarding. The problem is it might not be completely aligned. So the first place we start is with the service agreement. So we went through the sales process. We told you what we're going to do. Everybody was on the same page. They signed the service agreement. We want to revisit that. And the reason being is because, again, to your point, it comes back to expectations. So we break down that SOW by line item, but rather than just repeating exactly what we named it, we want to walk through and explain to the client every single item, by talking about what the deliverable is going to be for that item, what the process for that's going to look like. And then most importantly, what the communication for that line item looks like, what channels we're going to use. Are we going to talk via Slack? Are we going to via email? Those kind of things. Because it's really easy to get bombarded with, you inherit the client's email account and just get flooded with emails. That's not how we work. And so talking about the cadence of the communication and then making sure that we're responsive. So we make it pretty clear, hey, this is how often we can respond. We can't respond to you every minute of the day, all day. We're just not built to be able to do that. We have more than you as a client. They understand that in the sales process, but a lot of times whenever they're like, good, I just made this purchase, I just want to offload my problems, it's really important to kind of set those boundaries, I think. The other thing that we do is we also try to identify which one of those line items is the highest priority, because that's really important too, because what you don't want to do is put cash flow management fourth on deck and you don't get to it till week 4 or 5. And then it's like the most mission critical thing that you're going to do, that you need to kind of be able to be a little bit flexible in the order in which we deliver these things.
And I think just so people know, how we establish this is we have a kickoff call. And so it's even before we do our official onboarding. So we basically say, okay, you're going to start on February 13th. On February 6th, we'd like to just have a kickoff call with you and walk through all these expectations. And I can tell you it's as much for their team as it is for our team. So a lot of times, kind of the lesson learned on the statement of work and walking through that is there were several clients where we were doing way too much. Like when they said we're taking over AR for them, we thought it meant something completely different than what they thought. And so we're doing all this additional work for them and never really established that up front. And so we have this kickoff meeting where we walk through those expectations. We walk through exactly what it means that we're doing invoicing for the client, that we're doing AR for the client. And it has made a big change for us to actually have that communication. And like I said, not always for the client, but also for us. It gives the CFO a chance prior to that meeting and the account manager prior to that meeting to actually remind themselves what actually we are doing for this client. So that's been really key. The second thing you talked about there, Adam, and I'd like you to dig into this a little bit more, is setting the expectations of communication. This is something that's really key because, to Adam's point, there's a lot of people that just want to, email us 50 times a day, and they went from having a full-time controller to having us, and that's a little bit different. So it's us communicating those expectations up front. So will you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I would say that we measure client feedback on a monthly basis. You know this, you get most of that communication and are working through it. And what would you say the number one thing that we always get tagged on, if anything, whenever we have any kind of client service issues?
Yeah, it's definitely communication. We're not getting back fast enough, or we're not getting issues resolved quick enough.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about with the team is just the importance of emptying out your communication tray on a daily basis. So I typically do it in the morning, and then before I leave, I make sure that all my Slacks, all my emails have been responded to. And I guess the important thing that we coach there with our team is the response does not need to be the answer. If Jamie, if you email me on Monday and you have this like urgent question, or I don't even know if it's urgent, it might be semi-urgent, no clue, can't tell by the tone of your email. And I'm like, I need to look into that. And I decide to get back to you on Wednesday with the answer. I've got it all written out. It's beautiful, exactly what you asked me. You're going to be super pissed because you didn't hear from me on Monday or Tuesday. You had no idea if I got the communication. I'm not responding back. I can't tell you how many times we've done that. And rather, I could have just emailed you right away, at lunchtime or before the end of the day, whenever I'm emptying out my communication tray. Hey, cool, Jamie, I got your note. I'm going to be looking into it. Do you mind if I get back to you on Friday? So you can set your own boundary, your own deadline. You can push it out further than Wednesday. Give yourself extra time. Now, the client, if it's really urgent, might come back and say, hey, like Friday won't work. Can we do Thursday? I've got a meeting at noon. Now, all of a sudden, you understand the boundary, and it's like, oh, of course, and then you can get back to them. So I think that's the first part of managing expectations, is being able to set your own boundaries whenever they send that stuff to you. The other side of that, though, so that's what we hear too on the responsiveness. The other problem that you find, though, even if you are replying on a regular basis, is sometimes you're just not replying fast enough. And I think that's one that's a little bit more problematic. To your point, if you're replacing a full-time person, that they can just every time a thought enters into their head, they can just spill it out and have you get back to. I mean, keep in mind, in many instances, you're going to be their finance department. If you're doing any back office, they're relying on you to help run their day-to-day business. So they want to be able to just reach out and touch you whenever they can. So I think it was you, Jamie, that kind of came up with the idea of batch communication, right?
100%. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can probably better talk through, best practices in terms of batch management and talking to the client about batching their communication.
Yeah, I think the big thing about batching the communication is trying to anticipate the type of communication you're going to get from the client, but also setting the expectation early on that there are certain things that we just want to make sure we talk about in a week's time. And a great example of this is like cash flow and AP. So if we're already having a cash flow meeting once a week and we're having it at Tuesday and it's going to last 30 minutes, and instead of you sending me 25 emails that are all going to be, I'm going to have to respond to one at a time. I'm going to have to take, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours during the week to respond to those type of things. Anything that's not urgent, let's just put on a Trello board somewhere, or let's put somewhere outside of email, or have a special Slack channel where we can address all of those once during that 30-minute meeting. That way the time is a little bit more condensed. And so we talk a lot about batching our communication. Or if there's projects, a lot of clients will just sit there and, they'll be up at 10 o'clock at night trying to think of something like, oh yeah, this is a great idea. I should just send this over to our client, which is our CFO, which is great. We want that type of communication, and that's the services we provide, but that's not urgent. Let's just get it on a Trello board so we can make sure we talk about it in our next working meeting and say, hey, we know you had this great idea. Let's talk about it now. Or the client might even say, hey, we don't even need to talk about that for a couple months. I just wanted to get it on your radar. That's the type of stuff that sounds small, but those type of things can add up to 50, 100, 150 emails a week. And then we miss those things that really are urgent, and then we kind of forget about. And so that's kind of the key with batching.
No, yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, one of the most important things that you mentioned there was just having established meetings and regular touch points. I mean, we've got to train the client to understand that we've designed those meetings for those conversations. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to watch a Slack channel or see back and forth on email where people are just missing each other.
Yeah.
So the client asks something and then we're not really sure what that means, and we respond. And then they respond back, no, it's this. And then they respond, well, do you mean that? And you'll watch it like all day long on a Slack channel. And you can tell if the client's getting super irritated. Now, on our side, I know we're getting irritated, but we don't show it, right? Because the client's always right. But it can be solved super quick. It's 30-second kind of like, oh, if we just picked up the phone, if we need to, if it truly is urgent, or better yet, just have established like those types of conversations happen at Monday at noon. Like that's the purpose of that meeting. Because we really do, I think, do a good job of having certain meeting types that really accommodate for all those things, minus the urgent one-off items that happen occasionally.
And I think the key is, and this is what we're talking about in our onboarding meetings, is we being Summit, we're the experts in what make good clients and how good clients work. So we can come to them and say, hey, we have X number of relationships. We have 200 relationships, and the ones that work like this. This is how we'd like to work with you. And of course, most clients are going to look at it and be like, perfect. You guys know how to make this work. That sounds great. Some clients may have one or two areas. They're like, we're not big Slack fans. We've never communicated via Slack. Is there something else we can use for that? And then we can kind of come up with those alternatives that will work similar to Slack. But I think the big thing is knowing that we're the experts and conveying that to the client, that if you guys want to be successful, this is the formula. This is what it's going to take to make our relationship work.
Yeah. And as it relates to the service line items, I think it's just as important to talk about what you're not going to do as it is what you will, because there's always that, there's a million things that could technically fall under that bucket, but there's certain things that, we're just not going to do. We're not going to be the personal assistant. We're not going to be an HR. So even if we're handling payroll administration, that doesn't mean that I'm going to manage HR. So clearly defining what those things mean, I think brings a lot of clarity. And in some instances, you might find the person saying, oh, well, I thought that's what payroll management was. If you're just doing that piece of it, maybe I don't need that line item, which is perfectly fine. Go ahead and address the SOW there, get it taken care of before it becomes problematic, rather than finding out later.
That's what we want to do. And that's our whole point in onboarding is, I guarantee if that happens during week one, where they thought payroll was something different than it was, and we changed the services, you're still going to get off on the right foot with this client. That's not a problem. That was just a miscommunication during the sales process, where if 6 months from now you've been doing A and they thought you should be doing B, that's the type of client that's going to walk away and be like, man, I hated working with Summit. It was a terrible experience. And that's the last thing we want. And so that's why we're trying to establish that up front so we can change this work scope if needed.
I mean, that example, the reason I just had it happen a couple of weeks ago, client reached out and they combined our payroll and our expense, two separate line items together, but they were only signed up for the payroll administration. And whenever they walked through the detail of what those tasks look like, whenever we went through onboarding, it's like, no, you either need to add the expense tracking or not, leave it as payroll, or get rid of the entire thing. They elected just to keep the payroll, but at least we didn't bite off more than we can chew. Because by nature, it's kind of a white glove service and we try to impress the client. And if we wouldn't have had that conversation up front, the team would have just walked into giving away expense tracking for the client just to make sure that they were happy. and that wouldn't have been any good long term.
Okay, so let's turn gears a little bit here and let's change direction. Let's start talking about who's involved in the roles in onboarding. So we have a pretty big onboarding team. So Adam, if you kind of want to go through kind of the different roles that are needed for successful onboarding and talk about, what those roles involve.
Yeah, I mean, first to be clear, you can have a smaller onboarding team, but you just want to be clear that there might still be these need for 6 or 8 roles, meaning your head count might only be 3 people, but the roles still are 6 people. Or, you know what I mean? Like some people will do dual roles. So for example, a good one for that is our AM and PM roles. That's typically on our side, one person. So the AM is the salesperson. So that's the person that signed you up, Jamie. We're all happy talking through the service line items. It's important for that person to be on the kickoff call as we're walking through the service line items. They're the ones that understood your problems to begin with. We want to just make sure that it was translated well into the SOW. After the onboarding call, really the account manager role will fall back just a little bit, and they're just touching base once a week just to make sure everything's going good. And we don't even do that with an in-person touch. We use a tool called Customer Thermometer that measures, just yellow, red, or green. The account manager will jump in if there's any kind of problems. After that, once it's out of onboarding, then that person's just the escalation point for them. And they check in every 6 months just to make sure things are going well. And if there are problems, then they're the person that steps in. So pretty light role, which is why we have this person playing a dual role, which is the PM. In our business, the PM is really the task manager is their primary role. They're making sure they're not doing a lot of the work. They're just making sure the right people are doing the work that we have on the team and making sure everything pulls together. I think that's a really important role, and one in the past that we used to actually have doing the work as well. We didn't separate out those roles, and I think that became confusing as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the big thing that I always talk to our task manager about is consistency. So we want to make sure that they're the front line of consistency. Again, in my role as kind of the director, one of the things I see in a lot of our clients is what we're doing for client A is so different than what we're doing for client B. So if I could have a PM or a project manager that's making sure if we're doing revenue rec for a client, it's set up with the exact same template. And again, there may be some different formulas in there depending on what the client does, but it's really the key that the clients look very similar across the board and that we're not doing anything special for this client because we don't have to. And again, sometimes we do have to do some special activities, but again, I want to make sure I have a person that's seen multiple onboardings making those decisions and not just a person that this is their third account making a bunch of changes on it. So that's really important that project manager is having consistency there.
Which to that point is the reason why we also have them be kind of the designer as it relates to documenting process. So the first thing that we found that you really need to front load in these engagements is designing just mapping out the entire accounting process. I'm talking about how they do AP, how they do AR, how they do payroll, how they close the books at the end of the month, what financial information they look at. All those need to be documented. Whether you're doing them or not, like even if you're not doing the bill pay or the cash flow management, it doesn't matter because ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to own the financial information. So if there's a problem with it, you have to fix it. They also look to us to improve their processes. So, hey, if there's a better, faster way to do it, then we should do it. So having this dedicated PM person also, documenting those processes and then working with the rest of the team during the task manager piece to just look to see if there's a better way to do a process really provides that consistency that you're talking about. I think that's a big part of our success in onboarding is that PM role.
Yeah, definitely. So we talked about the account manager and we talked about the project manager. So what's the other roles we have involved in the engagement?
Okay, so with our engagements, we always have a CFO and an accountant assigned. So we get them involved right out of the gate. Obviously, we don't want them to be disconnected. It's not like somebody's just going to set this thing up perfect for them and then they just get to jump in. Sure, our team would love that, but that's just not feasible and it probably wouldn't work out well. You want them to be right there at ground level. So the CFO we refer to as the architect. They're the architect because they need to design the forecast and the KPIs. They're going to be the chief storyteller. So if they're not designing the information and trapping it in the appropriate way to tell the story that they want to tell, that'll be most helpful to the client, then it would be a difficult engagement. So we want them right out of the gate just to be focusing on how the client makes money. Walk me through all the different service lines you have, and then walk me through all the expenses, direct, indirect, what ties to what. They're building the forecast. That's their role.
Yep, definitely. And I think the CFO is super important. Obviously, they're going to have the longest term touch with this client. Again, the clients really want to have someone that they know they can lean on. And so obviously the account manager and the project manager, they're going to be there. The project manager is only going to be there for the onboarding. The account manager is going to check in with them every 6 months, but the CFO is their long-term relationship. So to have that person there involved with the architecture and make sure they understand everything that's being set up. They can't just be like in the background saying, oh, why are we doing AP like that? They need to make sure they understand it, because ultimately, if there's a problem, there's going to be the one that's going to have to jump in and fix it and make sure that they understand what's going on there.
Yeah, and the role of the accountant on the team is more of the builder. So meaning that while we went through the design of the processes and trying to figure out how to automate them and do those kind of things, the accountant's going to own those. So they have to kind of sign off on that design and build any kind of new process that needs to be in there and focus on those priorities that we talked about. So where we struggled in the past was trying to have the go forward and the look back team. So the look back team is that PM going through designing things, and then the go forward team is really on the accountant to just take over the AP right away. Take over, they don't want to wait 8 weeks for us to pay their bills, obviously. So that's where we want to leave some of the back work off of their plate and focus the accountant on all the go forward stuff, so the client doesn't feel like they skip a beat. So that's really the role of the accountant.
Yeah, and I think that the big thing there is leaving them the time, right? So you want to make sure that if they're working on AP, the first couple times, anytime you take over a process, the first couple times you do it are going to take twice as long as they are 6 months from now. And so you want to make sure the accountant, when they're on that engagement, has the time to take over the AP process, and it's going to take them more. So you can't have them taking over the AP process and having forecasting discussions with the clients. Like that needs to be on someone else outside of the accountant, because they really need to be working on that go forward and making sure that there's no problems right away. Because the last thing you want is to pay the wrong vendor or pay the wrong amount in those first couple of weeks, because that's not a really good first impression.
No, divide and conquer for sure. The last two people on the team play a little bit. It just kind of depends on the needs of the client. But we do have the tax director step in, just make an introduction, regardless if we're doing taxes or not. Obviously, if we're doing taxes for them, then it'll be a little bit more involved conversation. We're reviewing the tax returns and talking through things like that. But we at least want to offer the client some risk assessment, because we also partner with a family office that can do a lot of financial advisory and high-end tax planning. So there might be opportunities for estate planning or other things. More a holistic view is the reason for the risk management piece. Taking a look at the overall client and the relationship. That's what the tax director does. And then the last one is the IT team. So our IT team is amazing. Their role is just to automate things. So they're there just to kind of support the accountant and support the designer and the CFO. They'll go and connect tools that aren't connected. Hey, they want to convert from Xero to QBO, whatever that is. Hey, I need to automate this workflow so that this doesn't take me 5 hours a month to do it. I just need it to automatically go from one place to the other. They'll do that automation and really help with building some of that stuff. So they're actually really the builder more than the accountant. Like I said, the accountant's more of like the go forward person, but the IT person's an extension of them.
Yeah, like Adam said, these roles have fallen in different buckets, but I think as we've talked about what it takes for a successful onboarding, all these, tags that Adam has used are really important. We need the architect, we need the designer, we need all these things just to make sure it's successful. And like Adam said, you may have a 2-person team and that's all they do, and they have 4 roles apiece. I think that's the important thing, is just making sure those roles are done by someone and understood by someone.
Absolutely.
So Adam, we've talked about, you said 8 weeks a couple times, and I think the other our other point when it comes to onboarding, and you kind of briefly touched on this, but you want to talk a little bit about that timeline and what that 8 weeks actually means for us, and kind of how we front load it. I think front loading is a key thing that we've talked about recently.
Yeah, we're so process driven that we came up with this very rigid 8-week plan where we're going to do this one week and this another week and that kind of a thing. And I think what we did was we just really got ourselves off to a super slow start. We were so mechanical. We would just touch base once a week with the client or maybe twice a week, and we wouldn't make much progress. We spent half the meeting trying to catch up and remember what they gave us or what they said. The client really felt some frustration from that. I personally witnessed myself. I'm not going to tell you the vendor that I worked with that made me feel this way, but I went through their process and it was very rigid, it mirrored ours identical. And it was awful. I mean, for me, I was ready to just like, I'm done. Like every week they showed up and they're just like, it was like I had never talked to him before. It wasn't that bad, but it was pretty darn close. Like, no, I specifically said I didn't want this and I did want that. And I remembered that, oh my gosh, that's like probably what our customers feel like. So I quickly went to the team and I said, okay, I know it's an 8-week onboarding, but I all want it done in the first week. And of course, you all laughed at me and we're just like, yeah, whatever. But what I meant by that is like, use the remaining like 4 weeks to just fine tune, really get things dialed in, and then give us the freedom from the client's perspective to not have everything perfect. But if you really want to get off to a good start, we need to front load those first 2 to 4 weeks and get as much of this at least institutional knowledge documented, put into place, and forecasting built in order to really start advising and working with the client right out of the gate. Otherwise, people like me are just super turned off.
And I think this goes back to a lot of what we've talked about in this entire podcast is one, we talked about the roles. And so it's really important that we divide and conquer. It's really important that the CFO doesn't have to sit in every meeting in order to have onboarding be successful. So we can have, the CFO handling XYZ meetings and we have the accountant handling a couple other meetings and then the onboarding specialist or the account manager or project manager handling other meetings. That way it feels like we're sprinting, but each person individually is handling their lane and moving things forward. So that's one part about it. But then if you're going to do that, going back to what we said earlier, there's also the internal communication. We want to make sure that, okay, we already talked about the CFO being the architect. So if the CFO is not in every meeting, they're going to need to know what's happening in those meetings. So having just an hour touch point as a team and saying, hey, this is what we've accomplished this week. This is what we're accomplishing next week is really important as a team because we really want to divide and conquer. And then also allow the client to divide and conquer. Again, is there really a reason for their CEO to be sitting in an accounts payable process meeting? No, that person will be bored out of their mind. They'll hate that you invited them. So all we really need is the right person who does their AP. Let's talk about the process with that person and making sure that it's understood. And so really on both sides, divide and conquering, and then going back and communicating and making sure everything is being done.
Yeah, as you go through those process, that's a great point. It's important to call out who's going to be attending those meetings. So you kind of walk through what those look like and just say, hey, who is going to be on our side, who's going to be on their side, make sure the right people are in the meeting so you're not wasting anybody's time. That was some early on feedback that we got as well that I think is important. The only other thing that I can think of that's important to keep in mind whenever you're doing onboarding, just kind of in closing would be internally, to your point, the project manager is kind of running that stuff. But don't let yourself get out of onboarding without making sure that those processes are effectively documented and also leveraged appropriately, meaning that for us, we use Jetpack and we have all the tasks built out and we know who owns the tasks and do those kind of things. Jamie, I know you sign off basically before we consider onboarding done. I mean, you go through a process of validating all that stuff, right? Making sure the right people are doing the right tasks.
Yep, definitely. I make sure the right people are doing the right tasks. I make sure they're documented properly. I make sure we have plans for, what if the accountant's out for a week or what if they need to take a vacation? What's the plan for that? So I kind of go through that with our team and make sure that all that is in place before we can sign off on onboarding. And it's really key. It's a key thing to do.
Yeah. So as accounting director, you just kind of come in and do that final sign off. You don't really need to be involved in the upfront onboarding. I know they pull you in whenever they have questions about best practices around design or process because you've got all that built out and you've built a ton of great templates for us to be able to review stuff and that clients are doing. But it's really just buttoning up.
I try to check in throughout the onboarding just to make sure we're not going off track. Again, we have really qualified people doing that, but sometimes they're in the weeds too much that they overthink something. And we just had this example where we were way in the weeds on something and we took a completely wrong path on it. And then I was able to get in and be like, wait a second, guys, why are we doing it this way when we really could just do it this way, which is going to take us like a fourth as much time. But sometimes when you're in that urgency with the client, you just don't take that step back. So I do try to check in throughout the onboarding and make sure we're not going the wrong direction.
So if I'm a small CPA firm, you just scared the hell out of me because we just named like 8 people that are touching this thing. But
Right.
First impressions are so critical, and just getting off to the right start, that if you have the ability, again, even if there's just 1 or 2 of you, to front load all of your resources and get off to the right start. And like I said, we charge double during those first 8 weeks. So it's not like we do it for free, but we still lose our butt. I mean, I think even whenever we look back through it, even doubling the fee, a lot of times we'll still have way too much time into those first 8 weeks. But for us, it's more of the annuitized lifetime value of the relationship that way outweighs it. And if it avoids a bunch of rework down the road or problems or friction with the client, always obviously easier to, or more beneficial to maintain a client than it is to go find a new one. So it's super important.
Yeah, onboarding is definitely an investment in terms of hours, in terms of relationship. So you want to make sure you start that relationship off on the right foot. And that's what we've talked about here. And it's kind of our tips behind it. But to Adam's point, it's definitely, you're going to spend a lot of hours. You're going to spend a lot of time doing it. So, but I do think hopefully you got a lot of good information out of this podcast and we didn't scare you. Before we sign off, I do want to throw our email address out there. So our email address for this podcast is cpa@summitcpa.net. We're looking to hear about topics. If you want to be a guest on the show, anything you want us to talk about, please email that account. We want this to be a podcast that is reaching our listeners. So again, that email address is cpa@summit, SUMMIT, CPA.net. So I look forward to hearing from you. And Adam, thanks for the topic. And I think that was a good show.
Anytime.
Enjoy this episode? Visit our website at summitcpa.net to get more tips and strategies for achieving modern CPA firm success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.